In the age of empires, the dark continent of Africa stood as a beacon, welcoming explorers, expansionists, and adventurers. While the world was modernizing, all the British Empire's most talented, risk-taking entrepreneurs ventured south of the equator for a land of opportunity and deep enchantment. Their goal was to settle, exercise dominion, and establish outposts of Christian society in otherwise tribal domains that had not yet seen the roots of advanced civilization take hold, lands that lacked sustainable food supplies, let alone civil order. But as the old world in Europe industrialized, it also became safer, more bureaucratic, and more politically correct. Just a few decades into the 20th century, the seeds of self-loathing among colonial empires found fertile soil. This self-loathing proved to be a bitter nightshade, leading to the suicide of the West by self-administered poison. World War II would be the death of old world colonialism and the rise of statist Marxism, as well as a different brand of globalist egalitarianism that hated, perhaps above all, white men. Within a few decades of the war's end, decolonization and egalitarian globalism would demand cultural self-immolation as a chief national priority. But before all that happened, daring empire builders would go to one of the few remaining frontiers left to explore, Africa. One of those men was Cecil Rhodes, a British magnate who obtained mineral rights from local leaders in 1888. Rhodes' company was the British South Africa Company, and it was awarded rights to the territory from the Limpopo to Lake Tanganyika. The territory would be named Rhodesia, after Rhodes, in 1895. Rhodesia would become a white-ruled nation with expanding wealth, agriculture, and societal stability. Blacks and whites got along just fine. Ian Smith is a prominent figure in the history of the country, having served as Prime Minister from 1964 to 1979. A former British politician, farmer, and fighter pilot in the RAF, Smith would lead the effort to declare independence from Great Britain in 1965. At the time, the global civil rights movement was underway, and the writing was on the wall for those with eyes to see. Far from a push for simple justice and equity, the civil rights movement would ultimately grow into a radically anti-white, anti-colonial, anti-Western, and even anti-civilizational movement. What you might call in the 1960s Stage 1 egalitarianism would ultimately metastasize into a terminal illness in Europe, the UK, and the US, dissolving the vital fibers of nations in ways still unfolding today. Refusing to yield to international pressure to adopt these egalitarian principles, Rhodesia became a target marked for destruction by the ruling nations on the global scene, including the United States. A 15-year Bush war ensued, with liberal democratic powers like the US backing communist guerrillas against Rhodesia. As Smith famously said, it was the national will of Rhodesia to remain more British than the British. Like the old Narnians living in the wilds under Telmarine rule, the Rhodesians hoped to keep the torch of their old civilization burning there in Africa. Despite their valiant resistance, and thanks to UN sanctions and international pressure, the country of Rhodesia, along with Smith's government, would fall apart. After these years of Bush war, the country could no longer continue as it was. One of the last bastions of Christendom would become the black-ruled Zimbabwe in 1978, with Robert Mugabe taking control of the country. Backed by communists, including Chinese and North Koreans, Mugabe would spearhead the effort to eradicate other tribal opponents, leading to the death of tens of thousands. As a result, the country would be put on Genocide Watch and other related Holocaust websites. Today, Zimbabwe is a third-world hellhole at best. As we look into this sad tale, serious questions arise. If the Western powers after World War II were supposedly anti-communist, why did they support the communist efforts to overthrow white rule in Rhodesia? Why did Jimmy Carter and the CIA work so tirelessly to see Smith and his nation fail? What can we learn about this episode in Rhodesia? In this episode of the King's Hall podcast, we sit down with Will Tanner, co-founder of the American Tribune, Proud Wasp, and the man behind an incredible X account that focuses on many things, including the history of Rhodesia and why it matters today. As Will reminds us in this episode, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. We'll talk about the history of Rhodesia, the Bush War, and why it all matters. The King's Hall podcast exists to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world.
Well, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall podcast. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, a rare in-studio appearance, Mr. Pastor, songwriter. Some people call him the songbird of his generation, Brian Sauvé.
I only think you've ever called me the songbird of our generation, and only in podcast interviews. But it's good. I mean, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Here I am, joined by my good friend Eric Kahn, who many say is probably the most gifted person of his generation at enraging others.
That might be true.
That could definitely be true.
What an honor.
We are a match made in heaven. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. I bring the warmth. You bring the sharp.
Yeah. Acerbic, biting edge. Yes.
To a great subject today, Rhodesia.
Rhodesia. Yeah.
We don't have Pastor Dan.
No, we don't.
We lost him on a golf course.
Can't even find him. He's still trying to find his ball. He sliced it 300 yards to the right across a river, and he set off into the wilderness and said, "I'll be back if I make it."
Poor Pastor Dan. He's actually doing like good pastoral work
he's
right now. He's doing
he's
good
better
work.
than me at golf, so I have to when he's not here.
So we thought,
Yeah.
We're going to do this intro. We talked to Will Tanner.
Yeah.
Fascinating conversation about a fascinating subject. This is really one, Brian, where I think particularly on the right wing, there's a couple things, reading about the Spanish Civil War, reading about Rhodesia. There's something about this subject matter that gets people fired up. So I first heard about it from kind of the military community with the Rhodesian SAS and the Sella Scouts. And it's like, wow, this is fascinating. We talk about the Bush War. You mentioned that in the open. But there's so much about this story. We'll unpack some of it. Hope to do more content in the future as well. But why do you think Rhodesia is, I guess, one of those gathering points for people on the right at this moment?
It just, so many of the threads that we're still tugging on today in our social political discourse are deeply connected to that story. And you see so many of the same themes, and it's honestly a warning tale. You look at it and you say, this is what happens when you impose ideology on reality and you attempt to make reality bend to your ideology instead of paying careful attention to reality. How did God make the world? What's his law? What's in nature and in scripture? And in the story of Rhodesia, what you see are people who are driven by absolutely insane political ideology and attempting to force a nation and a whole people to function in accordance with their ideology that just fundamentally is anti-nature, doesn't work, it's communism all over again, just a different flavor.
Well, it's so interesting because you can read Ian Smith's biography, you can read the histories of Rhodesia, and if you read it today, you're like, oh, this is seed form, and not even really seed form, but this is what we now call the woke left.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Civil rights is going on in the 60s. As you mentioned in the cold open, there becomes this desire to destroy oneself and one's own civilization. It's also interesting, Will brought this up in the interview, and we'll hear this, but there was a civil rights leader in America named Andrew Young, and he was appointed by Jimmy Carter as sort of the ambassador to Rhodesia. He was also a close confidant of Martin Luther King Jr. and was deeply involved in the civil rights movement. And so, as Will has some pretty strong words for Jimmy Carter in the interview, as you read the story, you can start to understand maybe why Jimmy Carter by some was so hated, and rightly so. This idea that we're an anti-communist nation who is actually supporting the communists in destroying a white Christian Rhodesia, who is really trying to stand as sort of the last bulwark of the old Christendom.
Yeah.
But the idea that the CIA and Jimmy Carter and Andrew Young were all working for the overthrow of a sovereign nation. So they had UN sanctions. They had basically the whole world against them. And going back to Ian Smith's comment, we're more British than the British. What he meant, I think, was we're trying to embody the things that Britain used to stand for.
That made Britain truly great.
Right.
that made Britain a global superpower. Britannia rule the waves. That made Britain not just a global superpower in the modern woke left narrative of these evil colonizers who came and disrupted these utopic civilizations with their white ideology. These were the British brought order. They brought stability and peace. They brought economic prosperity. In Rhodesia, the average, I think it's like the GDP, each household's annual basic economic performance. It was something like $1,200, adjusted for inflation at their peak, and then it tumbles all the way to half or a third of that just within years of imposing this evil ideology and destroying the nation. So, I mean, there's an example of, even in the 20th century, England, the British people's bringing economic prosperity, civil rules, stability to a place.
Rhodesia was a great place to live under white rule.
Yeah. In 2008, we were just talking about this, the inflation rate in Zimbabwe was like nearly 90 sextillion%, which is just, I mean, it's a number so big, you can't even comprehend a number like that. Their currency was completely worthless. So they totally destroyed the nation, a people, prosperity in the name of evil ideology. And it reminded me of something that it was going around Twitter today, because England continues to do this. They're nothing like their former selves. I mean, they're now just absolutely in self-immolation mode. But this British journalist was interviewing some African immigrant. He looked like Somalian or Kenyan or something. He was in England. And he was asking him, to this immigrant, why should British people buy you a house? Like, why should we buy you a house? We don't. It's difficult for British people to buy their own houses today. Why should the British people buy you a house? And his response was basically, he said, give me a house. Give me what I need. And he said, but why? He had no coherent explanation. And when you just look at that exchange, which is typical of what the West in general is doing to itself via immigration, it's like that's a suicide pact. If in the name of niceness or this woke ideology, this Marxist ideology, even this ideology that all peoples and cultures are equal and completely the same, and there's no differentiation between the two, and the magic soil and propositional nationhood, when we start to believe all these utterly incoherent, ideologically driven ideas and then try to impose them on reality, what happens, it's not just that the GDP goes down, it's that genocide happens.
Yeah,
People die by the millions.
You see this in Zimbabwe. Mugabe takes over. I mean, absolute worthless ruler. He leverages the government to genocide other black tribal groups.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the chaos. Whereas when the white Rhodesians were ruling, they were like, okay, we got, essentially one rule for you guys. You cannot kill each other. And we're going to enforce that. And then there was peace.
Yeah.
And we're going to be fair to the people. They're a little different, and Will discusses this. They're a little different than South Africa because they didn't have a strict apartheid. Mm-hmm. And so some of the white-black relations were not nearly as heated, but they were very fair to their neighbors. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting, too, because people will claim, well, this land belonged to the black tribal people. The Rhodesians took it. Cecil Rhodes actually negotiated with the tribal entities for the land. And it was a time of peace and prosperity when they ruled. One of the books that I would plug, it's hard to find. I've heard rumors that it's going to be reprinted, but people need to look into this. It is printed in 1973, but it's called The Camp of the Saints. I've read the PDF, but this is by, how do you say, Jean Raspail?
Let me see it.
I mean, that's
pulled up here?
Yeah. I would say Jean Raspail.
Is he French?
He's French.
Then it'd be Jean Raspail.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
that's what I said.
That's pretty much what you said.
That's pretty much what I said.
People love it when I pronounce French things in a French accent. I think we can all agree that anybody who goes to a Mexican restaurant and all of a sudden says tortilla, that's a guy who's like socially aware.
I would like a tortilla.
Hey, can I get one of those tortillas?
Yeah. Oh, they
Hey, I would like a couple of tacos.
Chaquitos.
Martina McBride over there. It's like It's not. It's not even
taquitos. Taquito, yes.
The chalupa,
yes,
which we made up. That's a white, like Americans. We took Mexican food and the food of all of the world, and we took it to its apotheosis.
To its greatness.
Like we took the simple fare of Mexican cuisine and we invented the chalupa, the nacho cheese chalupa. And I would just like to take this opportunity to say to the world, you're welcome.
You're welcome. And also thank you, Chili's, for perfecting Mexican cuisine. I mean, I think that's obvious.
I love
the book, though.
But the book. The Camp of the Saints.
Really good. So this is a French dystopian fiction novel. Mm-hmm. And it's not particularly he's not like the best writer of all time. But he basically depicts this scenario in which, and he blames the church largely in Europe for having this open borders policy. Immigrants flood in, and the first wave, they welcome them, and then they destroy the country in short order. And so he's talking about what would become what actually happened in the death of the West through mass immigration to Europe. What's really interesting about this book, I know Charles Haywood has reviewed it, but he said, I actually think it's as important or more important as Orwell in 1984 or Huxley's Brave New World.
Interesting.
Because it's actually more pertinent to what the church has done.
Yeah.
You know, we're seeing all these ads where it's like, Jesus was a brown-skinned immigrant who blah, blah, blah. It's all part of this egalitarian Marxist world revolution that's still going.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important for people to read up on this. Our knee-jerk reaction in a society like ours is to say things like, whoa, did you just say that when the whites ruled in Africa, it was better? And the thing is, you can read the Reuters news articles on it.
Yeah.
You can read anything. New York Times on Mugabe. There's all sorts of articles. And they're like, this has been an unmitigated disaster.
Yeah.
Could we please go back to the way it was?
Yep.
And that's, the New York Times is not a bastion of conservatism, but you can look at the facts. One other thing that I would point to that Will has recently posted on his Substack and also on his X account is the truth about Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was also a communist and a terrorist. They committed heinous atrocities in South Africa. We just watched a video of a black South African talking about, well, I can't promise that we won't be killing whites.
Yeah, they said the reporter says, do you have any plans, what was it, for white
genocide,
to kill whites, to genocide whites? And he said, we do not at this time. It was something like that.
I make no promises about the future.
And it was and then the guy said, well, what would you say to someone who heard that and said, well, it sounds like you're keeping your options open. And he goes, crybabies. That's how much these people hate the West.
Yeah, interestingly enough, Nelson Mandela's wife, Winnie, she had publicly advocated for necktying political opponents, which is to take a car tire full of diesel fuel with a living victim and put it around their neck and light it on fire. These are the kind of people you're dealing with. And so this whole Invictus garbage that we've been told, oh, Mandela was a great man of peace. He was a wicked, horrible man. And the things, you can read Ernst Roth's book, Kill the Boer. I could not read that book, but for a couple pages at a time because of the atrocities committed against white farmers in Africa. And by the way, white Christians.
Yeah, what we're talking about.
These are our brothers in Christ.
And it's just astonishing the level of self-inflicted stupidity.
Yes.
That the West has, that Americans, that, even Christians have adopted and absorbed as their default programming. So that, and I mean, we're getting to the point now where we've made some progress in discourse where people are pretty comfortable now saying that, of course, we can measure cultures against one another. And of course, we would say that
it's we're returning to reality.
Yeah, the Rhodesian culture was superior. It attempted to impartially impose a system of civil rule on black and white, and everybody, they all were supposed to obey the law, and they came and enforced the law blindly as God's law would require for true justice. Okay, so you'd say that's a superior culture. And this is the play that I think everybody just needs to start seeing clearly when it comes to ethics 101, is that we've been trained to immediately knee-jerk to believing that an injustice has been done or is in the process of being done, whenever you say that some group A is superior to group B, you say like, and they're better than, they're superior. And before you freak out, you should ask, well, superior with respect to what? And then show me the evidence. Okay, like, is culture A or people group A superior to people group B with respect to this thing? And it's like, as soon as you get out of your Marxist ideological training, that's not a very scary question to ask.
No.
We do it all the time. You could say, is group A athletically superior on the mean or on the average compared to group B when it comes to can they jump higher, run faster, or are they stronger on average? You'd be like, yeah. Are they taller? Are Scandinavians on average superior with respect to height to Vietnamese people? Well, yeah, like we can do this calculation all the way down. I keep harping on it, but the problem is that we have been trained to impose ideology as a filter over reality to prevent us from reaching real conclusions about reality. And we're doing it in service of what we believe is a kindness, but what it ends up doing is give evil people manipulative tools politically to destroy whole nations.
Well, this is one of the things I think that we've seen this rise of the, absolute loser mentality of the people pushing the woke right thing. And I think what it is you have the old Trotskyite neocons. That's what they are. They were Trotskyites historically. But you have like the guys who want to enforce the liberal order as though it were Orthodox Christianity. And you have them, and they're seeing this trend on the right. And what's happening, what's ascending on the right, I think, are the strong gods of the old Christendom. People are starting to say, no, actually, I think as Christians, you have to believe, if you believe you're going to take dominion, you have to believe that Christian culture is superior and that people who reject it and worship demons that's an inferior culture, and we should not want that.
No.
I think part of this too is as you look at those trends, we're seeing a lot of infighting on the right. And one of the things that we do, this is what I keep going back to, but we have reality on our side, right? As you mentioned, these things are plain as day. I think also like in the American history, every time of year you get to Columbus Day and it's like, we stole this land from the Indians. I think the best way to deal with it now is sort of frankly, Margaret, I don't care. Read the history, read S.E. Gwynn's book on the Comanches. They were brutal. They were disgusting. That culture, I'm glad it doesn't exist.
Yeah, praise God that culture
form.
died.
Super grateful for the Indians who converted to Christianity and adopted civilizational norms of Christendom. And for all the rest of it, good riddance.
And guess what will happen if the West casts off the cords of God's law and casts off their Christian faith and apostasy? What will God do? He's told us. He'll give you over. He'll give you over to be ruled and subjugated by a people who will torment and kill you. And they won't be serving God, but they'll be serving as a stick in God's hand, like as a spanking spoon. Culturally speaking, it won't be pretty. That's what we're seeing right now play out in the West, is essentially apostasy leading to God saying, okay, you can have your ideology, your false antichrist ideology. Here's where it leads to.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's scary in particular to the liberal order guys about something like Rhodesia, to Will's comment, it's not the worship of ashes, it's the preservation of fire. I think they see that fire, particularly in young men, rising. People who love their people in their place, who are like, no, actually, Rhodesia, even though they lost, they stand as a valiant example for us of men who didn't give up.
Yeah, they certainly didn't give up.
They fought to the end. Will talk about in the interview. I was kind of blown away, too, reading his biography, but Ian Smith was like the consummate gentleman. I mean, like, he dressed appropriately. He treated everyone with respect. One of the things that was noted about him was how respectful he was to the black people that he considered neighbors and part of his country.
Yeah.
He treated them with dignity. There was law and order.
Yeah, this is what they call white paternalism, is actually just treating others with dignity, recognizing that in that situation, genuinely, I mean, and I know this is offensive, but the British colonizers were going into an inferior culture in virtually every measurable way. And they were attempting to not only, preserve and advance their own culture and their own people, but also to love and serve and lift up the estate of their neighbor, both by bringing Christ to them and bringing civilization to them, all the fruits. So the woke left, they look at this and they say it's white paternalism, it's condescending, it's patronizing. You say, well, would you rather have warlordism? Again, it's asking the white liberal, do you want to go live in the Comanche culture or do you like the one you live in?
Yeah.
Well, what you're advocating for, your ideology will lead to the Comanche culture.
It's easy to make a wild claim that, I'd love to live in a tribal culture. Yeah, but you live in a gated community in North America.
Margaret, you live in a gated community.
I mean, come on.
Your pool boy is Colombian.
Right.
Right.
Well, it's also interesting. I think Stephen Wolf has pointed this out. All the people making those really dumb arguments live in predominantly white gated communities with armed security. So it's easy and convenient to make that. One question before we jump in, because this is kind of the relevant cultural context. The neocons right now are calling our camp hypocrites because we didn't want Somalis in our country, but we're more than happy to have white Christian South Africans. Trump had a press conference about this. And he's like, yeah, we're more than happy to have them here. They're being killed by black people in Africa. Of course, Trump is a genius. He's like, they happen to be blacks killing whites. I don't care what color they are. It makes no difference to me. That's just what it is. I have a response, but I'm curious your response. Why is that not hypocrisy?
Well, hypocrisy would be if we were publicly advocating one position and then using special pleading and ignoring the principle the second something that we, wanted to cheat on arose. And that's not really what's happening at all. The fundamental principle that is governing the immigration question for those on the right, where we, not the neocon, but what I call the new Christian right, or a lot of the Buchanan type of right.
The real right.
Yeah, the actual right, is that we love our nation. We love our nation and we want good for our nation. We want to seek the highest heavenly and earthly good for our nation. And so we will pursue lawful means to achieve that end. And when we look at, we can either welcome in immigration, a country may accept immigrants. It's within their right. They can do that as a nation.
They're not required to do so.
They're not required to do so, but they may exercise in prudence. And as a nation, we ought to weigh when we're saying who may enter into our house. I am allowed to say I don't want Somalians who don't share our religion or culture. I don't want them. I don't want them in my nation. But I do want a people who do share my religion and culture to come into my nation and enrich it. And I'm being no more of a hypocrite than the person who says, my cousin may come over for dinner, but not the drug addict from the alleyway.
It's permissible.
And you would have to be absolutely obtuse to think that you're being a hypocrite for operating according to those principles. What it demonstrates to me is that these people don't understand our principles in the first place.
I don't think they really want to.
They don't want to.
I think the intent is to misrepresent them. Right. To make you look like a racist, misogynist, whatever. And sadly, like you said, it's just the egalitarian Marxist indoctrination that most of us have grown up with.
Yeah, they reduce you. They say you just care about skin color. You're like, okay, hang on. Whoa. Did I say that? Was that what I just said?
It's really interesting because these are conservatives, so-called, making these arguments against what we're saying. But it's exactly what the feminists said. They were like, so you're saying just because a man has certain genitalia, he gets to rule. You try to reduce it to the most absurd...
To an absurd part of the argument.
Not understanding that it's in the case of men ruling, we don't think it's accidental that men rule, meaning God could have just picked whatever. Right. It's that he designed man in his very nature.
Yes.
And including his physiology, to be a ruler.
It's essential to his nature, not incidental to some arbitrary feature of his mass. It's not because he has more active hair follicles on his chin.
Yes.
Right? Yes, he does, and God did that too, but that's not the fundamental reason. So we're operating on principles that they're straightforward, they're not difficult to discern, they're in accord with reality, and every time you push back, I saw somebody who, for example, they were commenting on this immigration issue with respect to ethnicity. and race. And they were saying, Christians may not advocate for a monoethnic nation, basically. I'm saying you're not allowed to do that. It's unlawful for a nation to say, again, when they're saying who can come in my front door, let's say that one of the things they said was, well, we're a people, we're Belgians, we're from this stock, and so to be a Belgian citizen, you have to be Belgian by descent. You have to be from these people. That's one of our criteria, not the only one, but it's one of the criteria. And the argument was, well, that is fundamentally evil to do that. I'd say, first of all, there's no principle, and they were saying on the basis of the multi-ethnic nature of God's kingdom, of God's global kingdom.
Revelation,
particularly. Okay, so they're conflating the two kingdoms, first of all. They're misunderstanding the spiritual nature of the kingdom of God, which is global and eternal. And right now, of course, the kingdom of God includes people from nations and tribes, manifold, will include every nation, tribe, family, of course. But within the earthly order, nothing in Scripture says a nation may not do that it can't have a mono-ethnic principle for immigration or for citizenship or something. I'm being so controversial right now. I've set off a car alarm in our parking lot. I don't know if you heard that.
I thought it was mine for a second.
I thought it was yours for a second. I was going somewhere important with that.
Yeah, so there's no prohibition on like what kind of mono-ethnic or ethnic a nation should have.
No, that's a lawful immigration requirement that you might say for a nation. And it would be perfectly within its rights to do that. Now, what was interesting, though, is because when someone else pushed back, it was like a Facebook exchange. Someone else pushed back against this, and they made the point that I just did, that there's nothing in Scripture that would say a nation's not allowed to do that. And the principle you appealed to, this alleged, not alleged, but the multicultural, multinational nature of the kingdom of God, which is a spiritual kingdom, would prohibit you from doing that. And the person said, hang on, so you're actually saying that it's a positive requirement for a nation to be multicultural. That's the implication.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting to me is that they said no. They didn't recognize that the implication of their requirement was that if it's unlawful for a nation to be monoethnic and to enforce monoethnicity in terms of its border or its immigration policy, that it necessarily and by consequence follows that nations must be multicultural, multi-ethnic and multicultural to be a lawful society. But they didn't want to own that because they knew immediately, they're like, wait a second, I know that multiculturalism is basically, we're just talking about egalitarian Marxism. We're talking about the very thing that we know has brought destruction to nation after nation in the West and is continuing to bring destruction today. So the moment that someone pressed them back, because that sounds very, very nice to the Western ear, oh, nations may not enforce monoethnic immigration. That rings really true to our default programming. You hear that and go, oh, of course, yeah, anything else would be crazy. But then as soon as someone pushes back with a rational, clear, not envy and hate riddled or, driven by malice, but just a biblical, scriptural, natural argument says, hey, look, that doesn't follow. And in fact, if that's true, then this follows. The moment they see that, they also don't want to affirm the implication. And that was really interesting to me, is that they wanted to deny not only nature, they wanted their ideology to be overlaid over reality, but they even wanted their ideology to suspend the laws of logic.
Well, and it's so interesting because all those same people, I think you're absolutely right, but the same people who will say, yeah, we can't be pushing for, uniform ethnicity across a nation. The same people are pushing for a monoethnic Israel and the nation of Israel.
Yeah, it's fine when they do it.
It's fine when they do it.
Yeah.
And this, we've talked about it before, but this just becomes part and parcel of the liberal international order, where it just seems like for Israel, there's an exception on everything. Yeah. And I think as a Christian, how I would encourage other Christians to think through this, because I think a lot of the neocons, I think a lot of them are Christians. I think they're terribly confused. Mm-hmm. I think realistically, they haven't thought through a lot of these issues. And there's a issue of integrity and virtue when you find yourself advocating for a position and the logic is bad. Like, mm-hmm. What do you do then?
Yeah.
And, the more that I've read on these things, there have been times where I've been challenged. I was like, wow, that just seems to confront my modern sensibilities mm-hmm. about this subject. And then what do? You keep reading and you say, well, let's find something that is logically consistent and coherent. Let's look at the way that people before like the last 5 minutes viewed an issue.
Yeah.
And you'll see that it's like, yeah, I mean, historians throughout history are like, yeah, if you want to divide, destroy a country, just flood it with like many people groups and many nations because they won't have any organizing principle. I think particularly if you look at something like Rhodesia, Stephen Wolfe talks about this quite often, but does that situation as they have it now, does that lend itself to commodious living?
And the answer is obviously not.
I think commodious living doesn't jive with genocide.
Right. It doesn't jive with societal chaos. It doesn't jive with economic chaos. And it's like, people hear me say that. They hear us talking about this. And it's funny because their conclusion is also just to revert to the default programming to say, well, you guys are just obsessed with race and skin color. People constantly say this. Someone told me the other day on Twitter, they were like, Joel Berry had slandered me in a million different ways. He said all these untrue things. They were just demonstrably false. And I calmly this is what I said. And in response, here's what Joel Berry said, the Babylon Bee guy. And they were just, it was like 2 + 2 doesn't equal 7. Joel Berry can't be right. And someone said something to the effect of, well, Brian, like you're being very reasonable here. I think you're correct about this case. But if you just weren't so obsessed with the Jews, I could hear you on this. And I was like, hang on, search my Twitter profile. And I went and did it myself for Jews. I've tweeted, I think, tens of thousands of tweets. The word Jews appeared in 17 of them. And half of those were simple theological observations related to the Jews. You search through our hundreds of hours of the King's Hall podcast. By percentage, what would you say has been dedicated to talking about the Jews or talking, it's like probably less than 1%.
I think this is the thing. We brought this up in the William F. Buckley episode. This is an old Soviet trick. This is out of the leftist playbook where you psychologize with negative emotions. You psychologize your opponents.
You're obsessed.
Jordan Peterson was doing this recently where it's like, I see these psychopaths on the right. and then just stop for a minute and say like, okay, psychopaths. Let's define that word. Where did that word come from?
And he's a clinical psychologist, psychiatrist. He should know what a psychopath is.
Well, and I think the thing is, he's a great rhetorician.
Yeah.
He knows how to weaponize his words. And it doesn't really matter in that scenario if it's true or not.
No.
That's the issue. And so, Stephen Wolfe brought this up at last year's conference. It's like, why on certain issues do we innately just default to this well, brother, I'm concerned about what's in your heart. Like if a guy comes up and he's like, hey, I've really been, studying golf. Most people aren't like, oh, I'm worried about the deep envy and obsession of your heart and the idols that are arising. Or if a guy comes in and he says, hey, I've been reading Calvin. I'm really delving into it. I'm really interested in this. I'm really looking at Vermigli and Tertullian and I want to wrestle with these issues. We don't accuse that guy of being obsessed.
No, we don't
psychologize him.
It's when you start even tiptoeing towards a subject that has been on the level of the programming, the rules of discourse, the rules programmed by liberalism, where you're not even allowed to broach those subjects, or it is obsession, it is malice, it is envy, it's all these things.
And then you'll have people on X, by the way, calling you unregenerate.
Right. And here's the thing, like cards on the table. When I said monoethnic societies are lawful, I think they are. When you look at the state of America today, my solutions, like if someone said, so what do you want to do, Brian? Like, what are you trying to do? What are you advocating for? Let me tell you the things I'm not advocating for. Never have, never will. First of all, I would say this is a complex topic. We are at a place societally because of not just decades, but over a century of really poor decisions that are woven together with spiritual apostasy, where the state of our society today it's not healthy. There are a lot of problems. I think there is such thing as American ethnogenesis, that there is an American ethnicity that has developed. That is, and I would agree with a lot of what Stephen Wolfe has said about an Anglo-Protestant kind of American ethnogenesis. I would also agree with Stephen Wolfe that there are many people who are non-European by race and even non-Anglo by race who lawfully and truly belong to this American ethnogenesis. I'd say Clarence Thomas is an example that Stephen Wolfe gave, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Like, is he a good American man? And Stephen would say, Yes, there's a good example of an Anglo-Protestant is the funny thing, is what Stephen says
too, which is funny.
And he's Catholic. So it's like he's neither white nor Protestant, and yet you can look and say, so there's something complicated about that. People often veer towards highly simplistic answers to complicated problems that are absolutely untenable in reality. And you know what that is? It's just another way of trying to impose ideology on reality. Well, so I'm not advocating, for example, that the solution is that we should genocide anybody in America at an ethnic cleansing. Like that would be an example of something that would be contrary to the American Anglo-Protestant spirit that actually is good and a result of our Christian heritage.
Well, I think even in a place like South Africa, I know a lot of people have wrestled with this. And I've seen, they've had maps where part of the solution could be, it's actually not, South Africa is not black versus white in terms of the clash. It's like there's, I don't know, I'll probably butcher this. One of the South Africans will correct me later, and that's great. But there, maybe, let's say there's like 8 different black tribal groups. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them don't get along.
Right, totally.
But what they had advocated was maybe one solution is let's break the one country up into different ones. Maybe they can be unified under some sort of South African banner, maybe not. But like the Afrikaners, like, we get our place, you get yours.
Yeah.
Let's see how it turns out, because the trying to do business together is not working.
Right.
I think that's lawful. I think that's a solution like that. But to your point, it's complicated. I think in some ways, okay, people are here, and there are people here lawfully from other, different ethnicities. That toothpaste is not going back.
No, in the
tube. But you can get rid of illegal immigrants here.
Absolutely.
You can stop this insanity of continuing to flood Haitians into Ohio.
Yeah.
You can absolutely deal with that.
Exactly. You can stop doing the bad thing that's destroying you. You can undo as much of it as possible from the recent to medium term folly. And then you have to deal with reality.
Yep.
And one of the, to your point, I think it was someone on Twitter, grew up in a missionary family. And they had been in some country where there was a situation similar to that, multiple tribes of people, all non-white people, like Africans or something like that didn't get along, or Pacific or something like that. And forever, the society had basically been broken along 2 lines where there was harmonious, commodious living in both of these groups, and they just remained fairly distinct. Now, they were able to have societal interaction, commercial interaction. They weren't at openly hostile to one another. There would be small instances of one group or a person coming and maybe going to a church from the other one or something like that. But generally speaking, there was voluntary segregation where they were like, we want to be our people over here, and you want to be. And what modern anti-Western ideology would want to do is do government enforced forbidding of voluntary association in that way, and force those 2 groups and say, well, you're doing something evil. You must now associate with one another on all societal levels. And we're going to force this by law.
Well, this is the crazy thing. Like, if you look at civil rights and it's forced desegregation,
yes.
The problem is you have the First Amendment, which is the right of the people to gather and meet in public or private to express, promote, or defend their ideas, beliefs, or causes.
Voluntary assembly.
It's voluntary assembly, the right to assemble. The way the Constitution is written, you are allowed to segregate. Meaning, like, we can say, like, hey, we're Christians, we're gonna gather here. We're not lawfully required to have everyone else welcomed into our midst.
And it's such a clear and obvious principle that accords with God's law and with nature. When you look at like, if you think of a household, of course, a household ought to have the right to voluntary assembly, where they shouldn't have to open their dinner table to.
And if the nation is the household writ large,
it's like there are many, in principle, overlap and extensions where there's analogy between the two. There's discourse between those 2 concepts. So what we've done is, in the name of an ideology that is false, we have violently imposed this ideology over reality and trained people as their default programming to filter their interaction with reality through the sieve of their ideology. And the problem is that the ideology is false.
It's in denial of nature.
So we actually have to fix that.
Yeah.
And one of the things we have to do to fix it That's why it's so important, like why I push back on this stuff when Joel Berry or someone else, freaks out. When you say something quite pedestrian and mundane in terms of logic and observation of reality, when people freak out and they immediately psychologize you and they call you names, I'm very interested to help observers see what's happening. That there is an ideological filter that is allegedly, like what Joel would say is it's Christianity, but it's not Christianity. It's actually a foreign ideology that he has conflated with Christian ideology, with Christian doctrine, and he's imposing it over reality. And then enforcing the rules of that ideology artificially on everybody around him, even on the level of discourse.
I think it was helpful when he kind of had a debate with Dave Green.
I didn't watch that one.
It was good because basically Dave forced him to the point. So he was like, okay, all these things you're saying, that's not what the founding fathers believed. So you have to say that they were racists.
Right.
And he was like, whoa, I don't know. And he just kind of like froze. But again, that's another point where it's like the same people who claim to be defending the Constitution, then, okay, but let's go back to what the founders believed.
Right. What did they
And it's not
understand?
what you claim to believe.
What did they understand themselves to be doing in terms of a legal construct? Did they think that they were imposing post-Civil Rights Act ideology on America? Obviously not. They obviously didn't think that that was what they were doing, since society was so fundamentally different and they didn't see a problem with it. It's just nonsense. Like, that's the problem.
This is fundamentally why Caldwell will call the Civil Rights Amendment era in legislation a second constitution.
What's the name of that book again? I was trying to recall it.
The Age of Entitlement.
Age of Entitlement. Yeah. Great book if you want to read about the Civil Rights Act in the 60s and what came out. Because so much of the Rhodesia story, the reason like we went into it in the cold open a little bit, like Civil Rights Act's like stage 1 cancer of a lot of these issues. And then what happened in Rhodesia is just a fast forwarding because it was such a small group and small nation, easy to be bullied. So we need to study these kinds of things, and we need to do it with our ideological glasses off.
The other one I would say, especially on immigration and the cultural milieu, is Jeremy Carl's book on anti-white racism.
Absolutely.
I think, like, I don't know if, I'm assuming Joel Berry hasn't read that, or a lot of these people haven't read it. But the issue is, when you're looking out at the cultural context and you're trying to deny that there's been a war on white people, right? Where it's like a black kid can stab a white kid and get a trust fund basically out of it. And there's like zero repercussions, versus like just what happens if a white commits a crime against a black, which is far less statistically likely to happen. But it's like the way that that's responded to, Kyle Rittenhouse, all of that. We've been living in this war on white people.
Yeah.
And so I just think it's part of it pastorally. Like, you have to know the people you're ministering to. You have to know your context. These things are evil. I actually think that there are great injustices being done. A lot of them are being done against whites.
Yeah. And because they're whites. And these are the types of things where, again, ideology, reality. Martin fact check me on this, post-production fact check me, and you can put up whether I'm correct or not. I saw this on a tweet. I didn't fact check the statistic, but the statistic was that 1/3 of adult black males are felons. Fully 1/3 of all black males in the US, adult black males, have a felony charge.
Well, I'm giving you the Gemini.
Okay, yeah.
So it says, it's technically inaccurate to state that 1/3 of all black males are felons. However, it is true that a predominant proportion of black men in the U.S. have felony convictions.
What is predominant mean?
I don't know.
That would mean more than half.
Studies show that approximately, okay, so it says it's inaccurate to say 1/3. Then it goes on to say, studies show that approximately 33% of African-American men have been convicted of a felony.
Okay.
So the math equation on Gemini is not
It's
good.
perfect. They baked the ideology into the AI. And maybe the AI is wrong, whatever. The point is that
33% of adult black men in America have a felony.
So there's lots of statistics like that, whether I'm exactly on the nose about that one or not. There are many statistics like that the knee-jerk response of most Fox News conservative men, or of men and women, would be to say, you have done something wrong by merely saying that out loud. Right?
Well,
what is that? It's ideological programming.
Even this and the AI, it goes on. This is where you get your DEI wokeness. It said this disparity is based on systemic factors, including potential racial biases in policing.
Yeah. And the problem with that, this is the woke left answer to black
The data
crime.
also doesn't show that, by the way.
The problem is that we should then expect that as societies become more colorblind and less racist, that would change. That bias changes. And yet study after study has demonstrated that the West in general and America in particular is the least racist by their own measures society that has ever existed in the history of the world. So you've seen these studies, people have been floating them around about like how different racial groups rate other racial groups. And whites tend to rate their own race lower, and other races, like it's a very tight, they kind of race everybody pretty much equal. Asians, blacks, Mexicans, whites, we're all about the same. Ask any other racial group. The blacks were the most, had the strongest spread, and they rate whites basically as, they get a D- and blacks get an A+. And so every other racial group in America rates their racial group disproportionately higher and other racial groups lower. So they're very tribal, and they basically practice what, we've been trained to think of as identity politics. So if it were true that all of that crime statistics amongst black community was because of racism from whites, why is it the case that as society has become to an artificially imposed degree,
did you see
not racist? Why isn't it getting better? Why didn't it get better?
Did you see the chart? Somebody had published this within the last week or so, but they were rating giving people self-assessment, like which cultures are the most racist.
Yeah.
And it was like, sorry, Martin, Mexicans were really high.
They're super racist.
The Mexicans were just like, we don't like, fill in the blank. We don't like Asians. We don't like black people. But it's funny because then the Asians were fairly, that's part of their culture. But it was really funny because then you got to whites, and they were the one, like, they were like the least racist because we've been trained in that.
They've been trained that they've committed a thought crime or a word crime if they say anything different, to the point where I guarantee you, and this is one of the things that Joel Berry got mad at me for saying. I merely stated that in 2021 at Weber State University, which is the local university here in Ogden, it's a public university. It's where I got my associate's degree before going into ministerial training. In 2021, someone put on a public bulletin board where you're allowed to post like notices or whatever. They put just a piece of paper that said the sentence, "It's okay to be white," which was kind of a thing that was going around. People were doing as a test of the blasphemy laws in our culture. Weber State publicly posted the picture, the surveillance footage of the person. I don't think they ever found him. And they launched a police investigation with the charge of criminal mischief. So they found a way to attempt to make this a police charge. And they said, we're going to invest. Basically, if they had found out who it was, you can believe they would have absolutely murdered this person in public opinion, made them unhireable, and put them in jail if possible for saying it's okay to be white. So that's the level of anti-racist programming that we've had in our culture. These are the ideological default programming that all of us have grown up under. And most of us are insufficiently and inadequately aware of how that has shaped the way that we respond on an instinctual level to various aspects of this racial and nationalist discourse.
Yeah.
It's why it's so difficult that even though I feel like I'm a pretty reasonable guy and can have a pretty reasonable conversation with people I disagree with, talk with Mormons, pickup artists, atheists, bunch of stuff in public, abortion clinics, we've done the whole thing. And I've been able to have pretty reasonable conversations with people who are completely opposed to everything I believe in. But when I come to Christians who are kind of a little bit more neoconservative than I am, and they're in every other way doctrinally similar, immediately they think that I am Satan incarnate for talking about any of the things we just said, even with fairly mild analysis and absolute factual backing for the claims that I'm making. And that to me just says, one of our biggest problems, it's why the conference coming up is called Recovering the American Will to Greatness, is that we have a problem of the will, where our will has been trained by our enemies to default to their presuppositions and rules for the discourse.
Yep.
We will never make progress if we don't cast off those rules, those artificially imposed rules. So that's why we're telling you stories like the story of Rhodesia, because it should absolutely wake you up and go, I've been lied to about culture, history of the West, the goodness of the West, the supposed wickedness of the West. I've been lied to. These were good people. These were good men, good Christian brothers, and they were destroyed by evil people
Yeah. No, I think that, and it's a good segue too, as we wrap up. Conferences upcoming. Still get tickets June 12th through 14th in Ogden, Utah. I think it's going to be a really good time with a lot of good friends to get together. One kind of plug, I've been thinking about this recently. There's been a lot of hubbub, if people have followed, about conferences and, celebrity culture and whether we ought to have them in the first place or something like that. And I think, look, lots of things can go wrong, but fundamentally, this for us is about encouraging people.
Yeah.
It's about seeing our friends.
Yep.
You need tribes. You need people who love you and have your back and who can correct you. We've intentionally not been really celebrity, especially this year. It's not like celebrity driven. Most of the speakers, I think, ourselves included, like if you went to a national platform and you were like, do you know who, fill in the blank, do you know who Eric Kahn is? They would not know.
No, nobody knows.
Nobody knows. But just a time to encourage our friends, I think, be challenged. We're going to have some great speakers, Stephen Wolf, Andrew Isker, CJ Engel is going to be on hand. Of course, Brian, you'll be doing a concert.
Yeah, I've been practicing.
I think that's going to be just a banger.
The concert this year is going to be at the church too.
Yeah.
It's going to be like stained glass, just a lot. I mean, hopefully a really cool, I hope we can pack it out, balcony, everything. And just, I want you guys to come and sing the songs with me because let's be honest, like I don't tour. I have to go remember my own songs. So if you guys could come help me remember them by bringing your kids that, sing Old Neptune and, make it happen. But you're right. The conference is like, let's get an excuse to hang out. Here's some interesting talks from people we think are interesting speakers with good points to make. We don't pick people based on how many Twitter followers they have or how many tickets we think they'll sell. We just say, what would be a conference I'd want to go to? Let's try to make that conference. You don't have to, we just hang out the whole time. We're constantly, we make fun of Eric because every conference he goes to, including ours, and we really don't go to many outside of this one in Ogden. Like
no, right response.
One a year. But Eric will be like, if we need to go somewhere after a conference, like get a plane, Eric will be surrounded by like 50 people just absolutely holding court. And he will sit there and talk with everybody for like 8 straight hours without peeing, drinking water, or eating meals. And so we have to like go pull him out. That's the nature of the conference.
Yeah.
We hang out with our friends. We want to, get to know one another, make business connections. We do some like business mixers and, VIP mixer for lack of a better words. But
Pastor's
like
breakfast.
Everybody that comes to the conference, you're a very important person. You're like one of the, we have some contexts we're trying to make some formal contexts that are helpful, but they're not about like going and getting your Bible signed by whomever, like, come hang out. It's going to be a good time. I'm really excited. Looking forward to it. It's going to be exhausting and amazing.
Yeah.
If you come, plan to stay for church Sunday. We'll have a big barbecue after church with our whole congregation and everybody who's able to stay through Sunday afternoon. We got the new Christmas game Saturday to put on some feats of strength and that sort of thing. It's going to be great.
It's going to be great.
Yep.
So we'll jump in now to the interview with Will Tanner. Hope you enjoy that. We'll have more content coming down the pipeline on Rhodesia as well. Sign up for Patreon. You can get a lot of access to that as well. One thing we're gonna do is book lists.
Awesome.
People ask for that. We have a lot of resources on Rhodesia. So if you're looking for book lists and conversations about those books, sign up for Patreon and you can find that information. Enjoy the interview.
Cool.
Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. I am your host, Eric Kahn, and today we have a very special guest, Mr. Will Tanner. Will, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
So, Will, for our listeners, I want to introduce them to you. I found you on X. You've had a lot of historical stuff that you've posted in your feed, which is really excellent. We'll provide links in the show notes to your X so people can follow along with that. But for people who don't know, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, all the writing, the research, and just kind of about you.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm originally from Georgia. I've spent more of my life since graduating high school in Virginia and North Carolina, though, just for school and life. I went to law school, recently graduated, and after coming out of that, I started a digital marketing company with a few guys called the American Tribune while in law school. And coming out of it, I was like, well, Twitter's more free now. I can see what I can post on here. And I had a few threads on Rhodesia take off, which X has kind of been suppressing threads algorithmically for the past few months, just promoting other content. But regardless, for a while, threads were doing pretty well. And so I had some threads on Rhodesia, South Africa, and the English nobility do pretty well on there. And that's kind of what I enjoy reading about and writing about and what did the best. So stars aligned on that front. And those are kind of my main focuses. I find them effective ways of critiquing mass liberal democracy, egalitarian democracy. And so that's what I really focus on is the devolution of Southern Africa in the Cold War and why the U.S. advanced that. And then similarly, how a similar, though less bloody process played out in England over about the half century before then, and how many of the root causes were the same. So that's kind of my shtick.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like I said, a lot of that content has really been fascinating to think through. Of course, like many Americans, I grew up in kind of this understanding of, actually liberal democracy was written probably along with the 10 Commandments. This is something that we all have to embrace. But I started reading about Rhodesia originally and got fascinated with that. My question for you is, first of all, just how did you get into it? What was the original nexus for that? Was it just personal reading or other stuff?
Yeah, it was very random. I found a book in Barnes & Noble called Blackwater by Jeremy Scahill, and it was supposed to be like this, this company is so evil, they like shot terrorists in Iraq, and that's mean type thing. But I've just found it to be like a 600-page book of the coolest things ever and thought those guys were awesome.
It's a great book. Yes, it is.
Yeah. And so through that, I found Eric Prince's autobiography, Civilian Warriors. Actually found it under a table the night before it was supposed to be released at Barnes & Noble, but they let me buy it anyway. And I was like, well, this is awesome. And then so through that, I found Soldier of Fortune magazine, of course, because that's effectively where you end up if you're interested in that sort of thing. And
yes.
Around the same time, Robert K. Brown, who founded the magazine, released his book, Dancing with Devils. And in it, he describes like his friend worked at the local airport in security. So he would smuggle duffel bags full of Ruger Mini 14s and banana mags for them onto the planes and then fly to South Africa and then from South Africa to Rhodesia to arm the farmers. And then he describes, patrolling with, I think it was effectively second tier Rhodesian military units rather than the frontline guys, but looking for terrorists around the farms and helping the farmers defend themselves and all that. And I thought it was really cool and wondered why he had to smuggle guns there. Because this seems like a cause America should be supporting since they're fighting communists. And then so that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of U.S. Cold War policy. That was broken up a bit by college, but then during law school, I had more time to read and kind of pursue that. So I just ended up reading about Rhodesia through first Prince and Blackwater and the Soldier of Fortune. So yeah, that's how I got there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to ask you on the threads particularly. You said Rhodesia has done well. I've noticed that as well in some of our content. But I'm curious why you think for guys today, particularly in America, why care about Rhodesia outside of the movie clip that people know with, I think, Jennifer Connelly and Leonardo DiCaprio. She calls him South African, actually Rhodesia. But outside of that, what's the interest? Why do you think so many people are intrigued by this?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. One is that as a really Anglo-Saxon country, rather than French or Belgian or Dutch, it strikes home with many Americans just because they can see themselves as being there and really had their ancestors left a couple centuries later, perhaps they would have been there. And so you can relate to it more than if you read about South Africa or the Belgian Congo or Portuguese Mozambique. It just doesn't relate because it's such a foreign thing. The system's a little bit different. The people are far different. The cities are different. It just doesn't really make sense. So I think Rhodesia strikes home just because it's America in the middle of Africa in terms of what it could have been, or really Virginia in the middle of Africa. And related to that, the kind of self-conception of the Rhodesians as settlers who were more British than the British, I think also kind of gets to Americans because, of course, we fought the British, as the Rhodesians did as well. But the Virginians and really the early leaders of America, whether from New York or from the Old Dominion, were somewhat British in their self-conception and certainly in their like manners and in just the way they saw themselves as needing to act. So I think a lot of the threads of the core heritage American spirit are very similar to what they were in Rhodesia because it's preserving this civilization that's very unique and individualistic and hierarchical on the frontier where you're having to battle these vast hordes of savages. And so it provides a lens into what America could have been like had it been born in the late 19th century, which is interesting because it's a thought experiment. And then from there you go to, well, why didn't this succeed? Why was America able to thrive in the way that Rhodesia wasn't? And for one, there's resources. We can be autarkic, whereas the Rhodesians never could. But more than that, it's that the spirit changed and it went from this world ruled by really people like George Washington with varying degrees of wealth and title to one ruled by people like Hillary Clinton that are just awful no matter their wealth and title. They're all just awful. And that's why Rhodesia was crushed, is just because of Jimmy Carter and Harold Wilson and these evil people that really represent a changing of the guard, much for the worse. And it's far easier, I think, to see that through the lens of something like Rhodesia, in which very few of us, or few people who read it were involved, because there are only ever 300,000 or so whites there. So you can view it a little bit more dispassionately than if you talk about, say, the civil rights movement in America or the Rosenbergs. I think the anniversary of their execution was recently. That tends to rattle people a little bit more, and it's harder to have a productive conversation than with something like Rhodesia, where it's more or less as relevant because the culture and history are so similar, but separated by an ocean. So you can talk about, well, why were we backing these race communists more or less purely because they hated white people? This makes no sense. It also made no sense that we were doing that in America, but it's a little bit easier to talk about in the context of Rhodesia.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because I think, I've heard people talk about this with the South, particularly Virginia, Stonewall Jackson, the brotherhood, the love that they had for each other. I've heard people refer to it as sort of the last death throes of Christendom, at least the old world. Rhodesia feels a lot like that when you read about it. Particularly, the picture I had in school of Rhodesia was these are just a bunch of racists who don't like black people, kind of the end of the story. They were bad and good thing we got rid of them. But you can also fast forward and you can look at the current government in Zimbabwe, and you can look at what's happened even in South Africa. A lot of people are kind of, sounding alarm now, but it's a little bit too late. Those same people, I think even Henry Kissinger was involved in some of the stages of what was going on in Rhodesia. So as you look at that, it does seem like because there's a revival in America of sort of some call like Christian nationalism, but just a love for people in place. It's something about that in Rhodesia seems to speak to us. Do you agree? Do you kind of see crossover with some of those trends happening?
Yeah, it's I think for one, they avoided some of the pitfalls Americans who are interested in these things fall into. I mean, as much as I love posting the pictures of Bill the Butcher in that movie, Gangs of New York, it's somewhat like an unhelpful ideology.
Yeah.
And the same could be said of the Confederacy, which was kind of odd because it has this hierarchical vibe, but they're also all Whigs or Democrats. It's not like these were high Tories or Cavaliers, really, at least most of them. And kind of the same with, like Christian nationalism or white nationalism. I really don't think they've fit the American spirit or self-conception particularly well, and they kind of have their individual pitfalls. Christian nationalism is, of course, somewhat different than a lot of those. Whereas Rhodesia, I think, avoided a lot of that and not really being particularly racial. I mean, they got tarred and feathered as this like racist country in the middle of Africa, but that wasn't true. It was more just a pragmatic, effective government. It was much more like Singapore than the Confederacy, and I really think that's what's like kind of interesting and appealing to it, because I think it gets to the thought of what Americans kind of on average want from government in terms of like not it's not a tyrannical one or really an ideological one. It's more just one that kind of allows people to prosper if they're so able. So there's certainly some similarities, particularly with Christian nationalism and kind of this love of place and love of God. But I don't think there's much of a direct comparison between it and any like organized political force in America now or really in much of the past. If that, I don't know.
Yeah,
if that
it's
makes
interesting.
sense,
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's helpful too historically to learn lessons from that, like what worked. I think I remember reading too, like part of the success that they had in the early formation of the country was they really treated the indigenous peoples differently than say America did in America when when the white people arrived. I guess to that point, just talk through the origins of the country. Where did it come from, and kind of the genesis story?
Yeah, so it begins with Cecil Rhodes, who was this famous promoter of empire. A lot of people in circles on the right dislike him. I think that's often wrongheaded. And amongst his many goals, one was building a railroad from the Cape to Cairo, so from South Africa to top of Egypt. And to do that, he needed the middle of Africa because the British kind of had going on down into Uganda and going up into northern South Africa. But they didn't have Rhodesia or the Congo, and they never got the Congo. But they did get Rhodesia because of Cecil Rhodes. So he organized the Pioneer Column, which was a group of, it was over 100 men, but not a super large force. And it was different than what you might think of in that it wasn't really the rogues of empire. It wasn't these freebooters or pirates or whatever. It was much more like people from across the social scale, so kind of from the bottom class and not many on the upper class, but some kind of that vibe and running the gamut, who were educated, really shockingly educated on a percentage basis, and competent and they were going to build something rather than just try and loot something. So he sent them north, and they came through just the country, moving up through South Africa, and they found that Rhodesia, they were hoping to find minerals like gold or diamonds as were in South Africa and being discovered at the time, particularly the Rand mines. They didn't really find that. They found some gold, but they did find that the soil was very fertile. So the British South Africa Company, which is what was organized, funded, and promoted to create this venture, instead of setting up so many mines, really started selling off the land, quite like the Virginia Company in America, where it's this company-organized country, really. And they found that worked well because there were no traditional constraints on agriculture like in, say, England, where all the fields had been subdivided by stone fences for centuries at that point, so you can't really take advantage of efficiencies of scale. Instead, it's just unplowed land as far as the eye can see that was really good for growing tobacco. So over the next few decades, Rhodesia became this incredibly successful agricultural colony. And what really helped it along was that the British at the time, thanks to Winston Churchill, were pushing disastrously high death taxes on the wealthier subjects of the king. They claimed it was for fairness or whatever, but really it just chased capital out of the country. A lot of that capital went to America, and some of it went to Rhodesia because unlike, say, America, where they'd be buying a mine they'd never seen, in Rhodesia, they could just buy a farm and farm it essentially better than they would in England, but it was more or less the same agrarian sort of thing with fertile soil, unlike the more worn-out soil of America, which had the Dust Bowl and had just the worn-out tobacco fields of the South. So we've repaired that somewhat, but Africa didn't have to deal with those things, so they could just take advantage of it. And they did, and a lot of people moved there. It became this really successful, thriving colony, and it became independent of the British South Africa Company in 1923, I think. And so it became locally self-ruled part of the Commonwealth. And that continued on until the 60s, which I suppose we'll get to in a minute. In the interim, it kind of continued on the same path of success. Unlike other colonies, it had a very strict immigration policy where they only wanted people who would become part of the local Rhodesian culture to immigrate there, no matter how wealthy they were, because they didn't want it to just become some hodgepodge thing. They wanted it to remain more British than the British. And they were successful in that immigration policy, which people who say you can't have a subjective immigration thing don't like, but they succeeded wildly in it. And Rhodesia was really a strong place because of it. And they fought in World War II. A lot of the Ian Smith generations, the people who were leaders during the Bush War, fought in World War II. Smith was a Spitfire pilot in the Mediterranean, got shot down and was on the run. It makes for an exciting read in The Great Betrayal. And that leads into decolonization in the 50s and 60s. which is where the British, somewhat at the urging of America, though also on their own initiative, decided to shed their empire. Particularly after the Suez Canal crisis in the mid-50s, they said they'd shed everything east of Suez, which they proceeded to do over the next couple decades. Lee Kuan Yew writes about that process really well in From Third World to First. In Africa, it was less organized than it was in Asia, and it was just a catastrophe. So Kenya fell, Uganda fell, the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which now encompasses Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi, broke apart. First, Zambia and Malawi went communist. Then the Congo fell when the Belgians left it. And if anyone listening hasn't read about the Belgian Katanga crisis and Simba crisis or Simba rebellion, they really should, because it shows what decolonization was actually like. In that it wasn't this flowery process where like Martin Luther King gives a speech about feelings or whatever, and then like everyone sings Kumbaya and talks about fairness. Instead, it was just rape and murder on like a continent-wide scale, and in the Congo, worst of all, because the Belgians get a bad rap. Most of the accusations against them are just spurious, totally. And they had sent nuns, priests, people like that to build schools all across the country. They'd built probably the best infrastructure, other than maybe Rhodesia or South Africa, in the continent, just in terms of rail and roads. They were never thanked for that. Instead, the Simbas just like tortured people to death, raped nuns to death, looted everything in sight. It was horror. It just absolutely horrible. Eventually, that was put down by Mike Hoare and his 5 Commando, along with Bob Denard. But in the process of that, the UN got involved, and with the UN came America and Britain and kind of the other petty states. The Indians were famously involved in the Congo, and they were all just horrible because they didn't care about the fate of the Europeans or the Congolese villagers. They just wanted the perception of egalitarianism and democracy. So anytime the Belgians tried to reassert control, as they did in the Congo, they were crushed by the UN. Anytime the mercenaries gained the upper hand on the rebels, they were told to pull out by the UN because it was racist for them to be restoring order. Really against the wishes of the Congolese government, which is just the astounding part of it. But it happened. In the Congo, turned into this disaster zone. And Rhodesia, particularly at the time when Zambia was still part of Rhodesia, was right below the Congo. So the refugees from this crisis are pouring in, and they're saying, this is like really, really bad. Y'all don't want to be part of this. So Rhodesia is one of the last colonial states in Africa, because it was part of the Commonwealth, not independent of Britain yet, said, well, we're not going to do that. We want to be independent of Britain so we can be independent of the decolonization process and the horrors it brings. They then started negotiating with the British, and this is in 63-ish, 63 to 65. That's around the time the Federation's breaking up, and they're trying to get the British to just let them leave. The British won't do it because at the time the Labour Prime Minister is Harold Wilson, who's one of the great devils in British history. If you read about anything he did, it's awful. Like an unqualified just disaster on every level if you're a normal person and not some bitter race communist. But that's not even hyperbole. Just anything he did was horrible. He raised death taxes to 90%. He pushed decolonization along. He was terrible to Singapore. It was just horrible. And part of that was he wouldn't let the Rhodesians leave until they agreed to mass democracy, which the Rhodesians didn't do because they said, we don't have apartheid. We're not like South Africa. Our system is purely that to vote in the national elections on the A list, which is the one that determined national elections, you need to fulfill either the education or property requirement. The education requirement was essentially a college degree. Wasn't really that common on the African frontier at the time, or have the equivalent would be $60,000 in 2024 US dollars in Rhodesian property. So a house, a farm, stock in a Rhodesian company, whatever. Then you qualify and you can vote. And they said, that's fair. It applies to white and black alike. It keeps our government from being run by people who have no idea what's going on. It seems reasonable. And to me, it seems reasonable. But the British said, no, that's racist because on a per capita basis, more whites qualify than blacks. So you got the per capita debate then, too. And Britain wouldn't let them leave. So on November 11th, 1965, Rhodesia has its unilateral Declaration of Independence, where in language that was really drawn from the American Declaration of Independence, it's another one of those links, the one we didn't applaud them for at the time, they became independent of the British Empire of their own accord and were promptly sanctioned by the UN. Really all member states participated except for Portugal and South Africa, and later on Israel. and everyone else did. It was the first time the UN did sanctions, and unlike pretty much any other time in history, they were mandatory rather than optional for member states that wanted to remain in good standing. So it became this worldwide effort to destroy the Rhodesians, which was insane, because it was just this like peaceful, prosperous state in the middle of Africa that it wasn't an apartheid nation. It didn't have some slave trade going on. It was just, it was like Virginia, but in Africa. And it worked pretty well. But they said, no, that's racist, it has to go. So the whole world ganged up on them. The Portuguese helped until 1974 when Salazar fell in the Carnation Revolution. And the South Africans helped until around that point, at which point they tried a détente policy like Carter's, and it was equally a mess. So the Rhodesians, for really that whole time, but particularly after 74, were battling the whole world. And the main rebels were Mugabe, who was backed by the Red Chinese, and Joshua Nkomo, who was a Ndebele rather than a Shona, the two main tribes. And he was backed by the Soviet Union. And America was interfering, trying to stop them from importing, exporting, and Britain's Navy was sent to stop them from importing anything. So it's this free and communist world effort to destroy the country. That leads to the 15-year-long Bush War, which is really how most people know about Rhodesia because it's this famous conflict.
Yeah, I want to ask you on the change of will for the British Empire. What was driving the decolonization efforts? Obviously, it's not just them, but what had changed in the will to no longer have a colonial empire?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because there's a lot that goes into it. I think there are two things. One is that America was extremely hostile to any form of empire, as was the Soviet Union. So throughout the Cold War, and I won't do my whole spiel on this, but just kind of a basic version of it, you get this concerted push by both sides for egalitarian policy. America called it liberal democracy, and that's ostensibly what we preferred, though if you look at who we backed, it was never like democracy, except in Germany, I guess. And the Soviet Union said they wanted communism and were a little bit more honest about it. But that's really what you get in every conflict. So the British won Malaysia, but then pulled out and it became a hellhole. Same thing happens in Africa. Indochina is really the clearest example of this because first we say we're going to help the French and then we yank the rug out from under them at the last minute. So they lose. Then once we get all the Catholics and aristocrats and kind of like that type of person crowded into the southern half of the country, we put Diem in charge where the Catholics are more prominent and then we assassinate him and let the Vietnamese government butcher the Catholics and the aristocrats. So at that point, there's no domestic support for anything other than communism. And then after we've finished with that, we pull out and let the communists take over the country. I don't know if it was a conspiracy or if it was just ineptitude paired with our biases, but it's what happened a lot in the Cold War. Really, the same thing happened in Algeria, in some of South America. It's just this mess where the same thing gets promoted at the end of the day, regardless of which side is ostensibly backing the winning side, at least until Reagan, when things changed a little bit. And so you get that where America and the Soviet Union are the two real powers of the day, and they're both backing decolonization because they both hate it. And that was the case really as soon as FDR and Stalin were chatting up each other during the three conferences and Churchill was kind of pushed out. You see Churchill fight it a little bit in Greece, and he kind of won there. But other than that, the attitude wins. So you get huge powers pushing decolonization. The other thing is that Britain didn't have the resources or the men really to make it happen anymore. The big change you see from maybe the agricultural depression in the 80s on, but really from the Parliament Bill and People's Budget, which were two things pushed by Winston Churchill and Lloyd George in 1909 to 1911. Those raised death taxes to 15% and took away the power of the House of Lords to really do anything. And that's important because it demolished the economic system that had supported England up until that point. So before then, you have a small government, and kind of the people who ruled the colonies or possessions were just gentlemen adventurers who wanted to do it and thought it was their duty to do it. After that point, they don't really have any wealth anymore because it's taxed away at increasingly just onerous rates. And so instead, you have this bureaucratic class that just wants to carve out its own little niche of support for itself and burrow in the system. So government becomes hugely more expensive. You just get ever more taxes, but get ever more taxes, but get ever more expense, but get ever more taxes, kind of that just disastrous cycle. And so by 1950, Britain has no national wealth anymore. All of its main industries, coal, steel, railroads, have been nationalized by the government and run into the ground. It hasn't really started importing many third world immigrants yet, but it's getting there. And all the men who in the past would have run the empire are either dead because of World War I and to a lesser extent World War II, or they're broke and have to get like a banking job because the government has confiscated all their wealth. So the people who in, say, 1870 would have been fighting for the Rhodesians against the communists are at this point either stuck in London, like doing accounting work, or they're just dead in Flanders, which is a real tragedy, but it was a major shift. So those are really the two things. One is the government is run by these spiteful mutant bureaucrats, and the other is that America is breathing down Britain's neck and demanding it decolonize because it's racist for it to have colonies. So those twin forces, I think, are the main two things. Though there's, of course, far more that was going on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That was one of the things I got from reading the history of Rhodesia was, again, you can read like The Death of the West, Pat Buchanan, or something like this, or any criticism of critical race theory, wokeness today, and then you go back and read that story and you're like, these ideas aren't exactly new. Yeah. They're just sort of maybe advanced in the way that they play out in culture. I do want to ask you about the war, kind of when a hot war kicks off. Kind of walk me through that. Why was that significant? Who are some of the major players in that?
Yeah, so on the one side, you have the Rhodesian security forces. They're never particularly large. I think it was around 10,000 frontline white troops at any one time and slightly less frontline black troops. And then there's technically a large national militia of militarized policemen and farmers who are armed. That's around 60 to 70,000-ish people, but the general value of militia can be seen in the American Revolution for things other than just like defense of particularly like homesteads or stuff like that. So it's a very small frontline force. And on the other side, you have the communists. Originally, they're based out of Zambia. And as I mentioned, they're backed by the Soviets and the Chinese for Nkomo and Mugabe, respectively. Eventually, the war expands to Mozambique, where the Portuguese were also fighting communist rebels and also under attack by America for doing so. The Portuguese lost that war in 1974 because of the Carnation Revolution at home, which overthrew Salazar and put a socialist government backed by the CIA in charge. At that point, Mozambique becomes, for one, communist ruled, but also a place the communists attacking Rhodesia can infiltrate from. So there's this much wider territory. Troops from Mozambique and Zambia generally don't attack the Rhodesians, but they do provide safe haven for the communists. Aiding the Rhodesians first, in addition to the Portuguese, are the South Africans. So from 65 to 74, the war is somewhat slow. It's mainly like small-scale light infantry infiltration and counter-infiltration tactics, where you see rebels trying to attack farmsteads or plant mines in the roads, and the Rhodesians trying to catch them as they get into the country. It's an interesting war, but relatively small scale. In 74, that changes when the South Africans back out and Mozambique opens up. At that point, it's on the rebel side, much larger incursions into Rhodesia that become significant actions. And on the Rhodesian side, it's eventually preemptive retaliatory strikes into Zambia and Mozambique, where they attack these rebel base camps that have thousands of communists in them. And that's really for what the Rhodesian security forces are known. If you ever see those Wikipedia graphics that go around Twitter where it's like Operation Elend, where I think 4 Rhodesians were injured and they killed like 2,000 communists. Those were successful tactically, but kind of renewed international attention on Rhodesia. So they were very large failures strategically. And that's really what the war was for most of the time. There are a few big battles where the Rhodesians attack inside rebels' strongholds, but really it's just small light infantry fighting, some artillery, some aircraft, some helicopters, but at its root, it's a light infantry war. And the Rhodesians were undoubtedly more effective man-on-man fighting than the communists, but they were really overwhelmed by rebel numbers. And the Rhodesians just didn't have the equipment they needed for the war because of sanctions. They were scrambling to get helicopters. They could never really import more planes other than 2 squadrons they got in the middle of it. They needed fuel the whole time, and that was a perpetual constraint. They just really didn't have the equipment they needed to fight. So that's why you see the Gray Scouts, which are those really cool pictures of Rhodesians in their fatigues with FALs or PTR or G3s, I guess, on horseback shooting at communists. They look cool, but at the point where you have like 200 horsemen trying to defend or patrol a border the size of Texas, that's just a challenge. And they did their best, but it would have been a hard war for them to actually win. The Rhodesian grand strategy really was holding out until Western governments became saner. Because when they started the war, it was Wilson in the UK, and then in America it was Lyndon Johnson. Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter were all awful on the Rhodesia question. They all backed the communist rebels more or less wholeheartedly. Carter, most of all. He was the Georgian, really involved with the civil rights movement. But all of them did to some extent. Reagan was friendly to the Rhodesian cause, actually. I'm not a huge Reagan promoter, but on this issue, he was pretty good and talked about it some. And had they made it to 81 or 82, perhaps he could have helped. But they really gave up when Thatcher won in 79 in England and replaced Wilson. But then instead of helping, even as they did what the British government requested, she, and I think it was Lord Carrington was her foreign secretary, just stabbed them in the back and handed the country to Mugabe, kind of regardless of what they tried to do. So their strategy of holding out didn't work, and the rebel strategy of just wearing them down with sheer mass eventually won. So there's no big battles to describe, really. It was really a country scale war of attrition in which the civilian population was involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk a little bit about Ian Smith, kind of his role in this. I'm sure you've mentioned the autobiography. It's changed titles, I think, at least once, but the significance of him, of course, I think I've read he was one of the ones that would say that they were more British than the British. But what's his role in this? Just kind of talk through him as a figure.
Yeah, so Smith was born, I forget what his familial background was, but I think it was one of the older Rhodesian families, and they had a pretty large farm. Originally, the Rhodesians farmed tobacco and cattle, and then during the war, because they couldn't import food, they switched to grain and cattle, which, because that lasted for a bit after the war, they became known as the breadbasket of Africa, so that's how they got that name. But so he was a farmer like that. Somewhat like Cincinnatus or George Washington, yeah, you see his desire to just go back to farming as he's continually put in charge just happen, where he'll be like, I just want to go back to my plantation, but instead he's stuck in Salisbury running the government. So it's interesting in that respect. He's very much the sort of leader you'd want to have, who's just a once-in-a-century type figure. He, as a young man, joins the Rhodesian Air Force. It later became known as the Rhodesian Royal Air Force. Or Royal Rhodesian Air Force, and mainly fought in the Mediterranean during World War II. That's where he was a Spitfire pilot. He was shot down over, I think, Italy, and had to remain, it could have been Greece, but it was Greece or Italy, and remained on the run from the Germans, hiding out in these villages for months. He did that, so he was something of a popular war hero because of that. He came back and got involved in government, and originally Rhodesia, like Britain, had the conservative labor divide in terms of parties, from what I remember. Yeah, he pretty quickly, after becoming a popular figure, changed that. And his party was the Rhodesian Front, which somewhat transcended the traditional Tory labor divide, in that it was really a party for those who wanted Rhodesia to remain Rhodesia, which white rule isn't the right term, because the black village chiefs backed Ian Smith. They were kind of integral to running the government on the ground, which always sounds like a cop-out, because it's like, well, look at these village chiefs. But it's really not, because they were very important to how the government functioned, and they almost unanimously supported Ian Smith, Shona, or Ndebele. So it's an interesting government because it represents, on one hand, the will of this 250,000 to 300,000 person, depending on what year you're looking at, strong white settler population. But then on the other hand, really largely the a large, couple million strong mass of black Rhodesians. And they controlled most of the government for really the entirety of the Bush War. Their main issue with Smith at the helm was independence with what they called responsible government, which meant the keeping of that propertied voting system. Because they said, well, if you look at anywhere else in the continent, either they have apartheid, which is in South Africa, which we don't want because we just don't agree with that philosophically, and or they get one man, one vote, one time dictators like those in the Congo or anywhere else you look, where it's just a pretend vote that leads to a dictator, which of course happened in Zimbabwe a few years later, but they tried to prevent. And so you don't get these debates over like tax policy really like you do in the UK at the time or nationalization. It was really the Rhodesian Front's goal was ensuring the independence of the country. And Smith remains at the helm for the entire period in which it's trying to do so. He's in charge, or he's the prime minister in 1965 when they declare independence, and that lasted until 79, when first he stepped down to share power with Bishop Abel Muruzewa. I can never pronounce those African names, but it was like a moderate black leader, and that's when they were trying to deal with Thatcher. It didn't work, but Smith did that, and then he stepped down and fully, and Mugabe took over. And really throughout that period, Smith was the one who dealt with the British, dealt with the Americans, and tried to present Rhodesia's cause and explain why it was important to fight. That's where you get like those videos of his debate with William Buckley, where Buckley's like, well, don't you care about equality? And Smith's like, we don't want people eating each other, so no. And I forget his exact words, but it's something like that. Yeah. Buckley's like, well, but in America, we have one man, one vote. And Smith's like, it's a disaster. Yeah, Smith did that. He led the country throughout the war. A few supporting characters helped him. P.K. Vanderbilt was a Boer from South Africa and really a South African aristocrat in spirit and in wealth who came to help the Rhodesians out. Also involved kind of on that front was the Duke of Montrose, who was one of the British who left really for tax reasons and became a large landowner. And he helped Smith continue to win over black support with agricultural policy in terms of setting aside land that no one owned for them to farm, and that helped a good deal. And that was kind of the Smith government. They were never particularly ideological. They were very pragmatic. They really just wanted the country to function as it tried to fight for independence. And in that, they were quite successful. You can read it's an article in City Journal. I think it comes from his book, The Man's Dreams and the Masses, but it's Dr. Theodore Dalrymple, and he describes being in Rhodesia as a doctor in like 76 and 77, so towards the end of the Bush War as it's really heating up. And the roads were good, the schools were good, the hospitals were probably the best on the continent for blacks and whites alike. The country just worked, and they did a pretty good job running it, but they lost the war. So Smith, to finally answer your question in conclusion, he was this titanic figure. There's no real way to describe him other than that, who represented the Rhodesian soul of this more British than the British settler conquest vibe, and really did it well. He was always well-dressed. Just as one anecdote on that point, I had on my podcast a guy named Roy Duncan, who's originally from Rhodesia, now lives in South Africa. And he was talking, I forget the exact situation, but to someone at one of the famous South African clubs. And he asked about Ian Smith. Or he asked one of the butlers, this black attendant at the club, who, in your estimation, is the greatest gentleman who's ever been here? Something to that effect. And the butler, without missing a beat, said Ian Smith. He always remembered our names. He was always very polite. He was always perfectly attired, perfectly well-spoken, knew everyone, was friends with everyone, could make his point eloquently, far more eloquently than I'm doing now. And Ian Smith was just the encapsulation of this British spirit that had conquered a quarter of the world. And he was really the last man of that type. And he was deposed in 1980 by the whole world, who put Mugabe in charge, and a lot of good that did.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because, as like I said, it can be nostalgic to look back at that time period. Obviously, want to learn lessons, but still be inspired, I think, by Ian Smith and guys like that. Talk about Rhodesia after Mugabe takes over, and kind of where the country is today. Where are the people?
Yeah, so you go from Ian Smith, who's like a character from Plutarch's Lives. Like he's really one of the few people from modernity who's somewhat like a classical hero just in terms of demeanor. And you go from that to Robert Mugabe, who's really like a joke character out of a Tom Wolfe novel. One of the jokes about Mugabe was that he was so slow in destroying the country because he wanted enough time to go to Savile Row and get fit for suits before destroying it. So he's always like, if you look up pictures of him, he's always just in these like absurd suits. Like there's one where it's bright yellow with a bunch of green and red icons on it. He's wearing like sunglasses, or he looks like an African dictator, and very much was an African dictator. And so you get 3 different periods from Mugabe. The first is when he's solidifying power, really during the election and immediately afterward. First, that was the voter intimidation in 1980, where the British were there. I think it was British troops and troops from New Zealand who were supposed to be maintaining order. After the Rhodesians said, well, we'll let there be an election. We'll just see what happens. The British let Mugabe intimidate all the blacks in the country into voting for him. So he won. He threatened to kill them, chop their arms off if they didn't vote for him. So, of course, he won, because that works reasonably well when it's not a secret ballot. So then after he won, he genocided the Ndebele, which were the opposing tribe. And that goes back to the founding of Rhodesia. There were the Shona and the Ndebele, or Matabele, depending on which spelling you use. And the Rhodesians backed the Ndebele for most of their history. That was the tribe that was originally prominent and powerful inside Rhodesia. The British kind of did their thing where they worked with them to maintain stability. That had died out, really, by Smith's time, from what I can tell, but it was a legacy where the two groups hated each other, somewhat like in Rwanda. So you got more or less the same thing, where he killed tens of thousands of them with the aid of Chinese and I believe North Korean troops, and troops of his that were trained over there. And so at that point, he had complete control in the country, because the whites had only ever been slightly under 300,000 at their maximum and had been net fleeing since 1974. And so by the time Mugabe takes over, it's a pretty hollowed out group. He's then isn't that bad for about a decade. The British were funding any farmland purchases. So whenever he bought farms to hand to his troops as a way of fulfilling his vow during the War of Giving Them Land, the British paid for it as part of like a post-colonial settlement kind of thing. And for whatever reason, during that period, Mugabe was pretty moderate in his purchases of farmland and handing it out to people, though the British were paying for it. So it's somewhat limited, and things are okay. That's really the period where Rhodesia is known as the breadbasket of Africa, because it's producing all this grain from the war, and everywhere else in the continent's a wreck. So it's has the ability to export again and does well. That leads into the 90s, where the veterans, it's been about 10 years, 10 and a half, or 15-ish years since the war, they want what they were promised, which was land and wealth. So first, Mugabe loots the treasury to give them all like 50,000 Zimbabwean dollars or something like that. It didn't really work out to that much on an American dollar adjusted basis, but it was enough to bankrupt Zimbabwe, which is when he starts printing money to pay for it. Throughout his reign, there was double-digit levels of inflation, but that's really where the inflation starts getting bad. But then the veterans aren't appeased, and the British say, we're not paying for your land seizures anymore. We're done with this. So then kind of after this middling ground second period where it's uncomfortable, but the whites are still surviving if they want to remain there, he seizes all the land. And that begins in the early 2000s and continues into the mid-2010s. By 2013, there's not a white farm left in the country. They were all expropriated. Because the Rhodesians generally had good relationships with their black laborers, kind of one of the interesting things about Rhodesia, there wasn't this blood feud like there was in South Africa. There isn't really a genocide of the whites there in the same way that like there would be in South Africa right now, or like there was in the Belgian Congo. Instead, it's somewhat violent, and some of them die, which it's a horrible tragedy. I'm not minimizing it, but most of them leave alive, but without any money or wealth, because it was all confiscated. That's somewhat less so in the cities, where some of them flee, like Salisbury, now called Harare. Some of them could survive there, but most left. So the country becomes a wreck. Unemployment rose to like 60% or something. Agricultural production dropped by like 85%. Hyperinflation went to like 30 gazillion percent or some just astounding number. So you get those $100 trillion notes that expired after like it was just a mess. Often they couldn't even pay the printers to make the hyperinflated currency. So it's just a disaster. And it really came because of Mugabe's race communist policy. And then Mugabe's deposed in 2017 by the army and dies in 2019. And there's something of a government there now. It's still kind of affiliated with the military. They might have had like a nominal election, but it's Africa. That government has been trying to encourage the whites to come back to make the country not a wreck. First, they just offered them their farmland back. A couple hundred people took them up on the offer. Now they're offering to just pay anyone who had their farm expropriated for the expropriation. It's unclear how well their policy to bring Rhodesians back will succeed. On one hand, like in 2023, Miss Zimbabwe was white, which was shocking. And I think they just nominated someone to some international court who was white. So it's not as of a racially hostile government as it could be, but it's not great. So Zimbabwe's fortunes have gotten a little bit better since Mugabe was deposed, but it's still a train wreck of a country.
Yeah, fascinating. I guess just as we wrap things up, just you thinking about Rhodesia, some of the lessons that maybe you pull away from it. What do people take away? What do you take away from it to learn from politically? Maybe it's on the liberal democracy side or not, but just curious your kind of assessment.
Yeah, for sure. I think there are two big things. The first is what I was talking about earlier with the Cold War. There's this tendency to think of the Cold War as like the based CIA was assassinating communists around the world, and it was this great fight for like right-wing values against these wretched atheist communists. There were maybe like a couple one-year periods where that was vaguely true. Eisenhower in like 54, Reagan in the kind of the early middle of his presidency. Other than that, it's just like entirely false in every way. And what we were doing was just backing leftist governments that nominally weren't communist because doing so destroyed the colonial order that we saw as racist because of our civil rights woes. And I think that needs to be understood about the Cold War because, for one, it makes the whole conflict and what happened to make more sense. But it also informs like what's going on today. Like, why is everywhere a train wreck? Where it used to, like in 1910, all these places were pretty prosperous and well managed. Why aren't they now? And it's because of what really we did during the Cold War, and that's why they don't like us. So there's a lot of that there, and I think it's really important. So don't believe the lies about like the CIA being this based shadow entity that's like fighting communism. It's just like if you took all the liberal, like the far left professors you hated at university and put them in charge of destroying like white governments around the globe, that's essentially the CIA. Which I say white just because a lot of the colonial governments could have succeeded had the Europeans stayed really as like the African natives wanted them to, but they weren't allowed to. And it was more than just the English. It was the Belgians, it was the French, it was the Portuguese, it was the Spanish, it was also the British. It's kind of all over the place. The second thing is that like all this always leads to the same place. This is why I really focus on England and Zimbabwe, is because they're opposite sides of the same coin. So in England, you have non-racial egalitarian policy with the Parliament Bill, with the People's Budget, and with kind of all the legislation that followed. And what you get with that is poverty. Like Britain now on a per capita basis is poorer than Mississippi, which I think is the poorest per capita state in America. And it's by an astonishing margin. It's like by 25% or 20% or something.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's shocking. And you look at that, Britain in like 1870 was the wealthiest place on earth. It was the leader in the Industrial Revolution, controlled a quarter of the world. It had 1,000-year history of success, or 800 years, and that was obliterated for no real reason. It was just because of petty resentment and grievance and a desire to level things, where there was certainly no justification for doing so, but no real cause for doing so other than just envy. Like things were getting better in Britain really because of the accomplishments of the people at the top, using the people at the bottom, but like it wasn't the poor of London who were building the railroads or conquering the globe. So you get this like envious, egalitarian, destructive policy in England that wrecks the country, where it's still a train wreck today, and now it's a shadow of its former self. I think they have like 24, 25 operational tanks for England. So it's just a disaster. But then the same is true of Zimbabwe. There it was more explicitly racial once Mugabe took over, but really it's the same thing. It's this politics of envy, this just desire to destroy because something greater than what you could build exists. And that made no sense and wasn't really supported by a majority of the population until Mugabe intimidated them into it. But it was certainly the motivating spirit of the communists, and it was similarly the motivating spirit of the people in America who supported it. Excuse me. So on one hand, you have Harold Wilson, who I've described before. On the other, really in the terminal stages when this was a big issue because independence happened, but the war had kind of ground on. So from like 75 to 79, who's in charge? It's Jimmy Carter, who's just the worst. And his head guy leading it was Andy Young, who was this Atlanta area civil rights activist who Carter put in charge of the UN. It was like Young is just a straight up communist. He cheered for the murder of white people as it was happening. Like in 1979, sorry for the side note, but it's relevant to this. Nkomo's men shot down 2 civilian airliners. One was either the beginning of 79 or end of 78. The other was into 79. And Nkomo admitted his men did it, and stories quickly emerged that were verified that not only did they shoot down the planes, but they raped and then bayoneted to death all their survivors. Like they would cut open the pregnant women's stomachs and then stab the babies. It was stuff like you saw in the Congo.
Horrible.
Yeah, horrible. Nkomo admitted to it, laughed it off. Young then went on a speaking tour defending Nkomo for doing it and saying it was justified because the whites were racist.
Man.
Yeah. So, and he knew what had happened and was defending it regardless. He said, no, Mugabe and Nkomo are peaceful men. They only want peace. It was absurd. And so that's what Jimmy Carter stood for. So when he died in January or December, I was Cheering it, saying, God made him worm food and he'll have a fun time in hell. Jimmy Carter, he gets called this saint because he ran a Sunday school. But if you don't hate Jimmy Carter, then you don't know a lick of American history. He was a very evil man. And so anyway, it's my personal vendetta against Jimmy Carter.
That's okay. I share it.
Sorry. But I just think it's an important lesson because we forget that this has happened in America. If you look at the hollowing out of our cities, just huge explosions in crime, and really the attendant economic dysfunction that comes from forcing everyone into suburbs an hour outside of city centers and all the DEI mandates. We have a lesser version in America of what was inflicted upon Zimbabwe for much the same reasons. And we need to destroy it before it destroys us for much the same reasons. So really, Rhodesia is important as a lesson of that, much like England is. These politics of envy, you get based right-wing populism or based left-wing populism. And it's whoa, we need to steal from people because we want to. And it's always a mess. I think people tend to forget that. You saw this in Argentina with Perón. You saw it in England with the entirety of the 20th century. And most poignantly, you saw it in Zimbabwe, where it happened in the blink of an eye. And it's just a disaster. So I really think that's the big challenge America is going to face, is defeating this race communism, this egalitarianism. And we need to remember examples of where it has been inflicted upon people. And I think Zimbabwe is one of the best examples of it. So yeah, those are really the 2 reasons I think it's useful.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. For people who want to look more into this, I'm just curious. I know you've posted it in different places, but kind of top couple books that you would recommend to check out.
Yeah, so 2 that are hard to find, but hopefully will be republished are Rhodesia Accuses by A.J.A. Peck, who was an American who visited Rhodesia and wrote about the roots of the conflict. It's a really short book. It's 150 pages or something, but it's written from an American perspective about how the communists behaved. So he has these horror stories of them torturing the black villagers to get them to support Mugabe. It's from the mid-60s. And about the Rhodesian government and how it functioned. So it's really useful as a little handbook for, what was actually going on inside the country from an eyewitness American perspective that was, I think, pretty honest. The second, also hard to find, but worth it if you can find a reasonably priced copy, which you have to look around, but sometimes can be achieved, is The Great Betrayal by Ian Smith. It was republished as Bitter Harvest. They're the same book except for an introduction. That's Ian Smith's personal autobiography. It really tells the story of diplomacy during the Bush War well, and really exposes well the duplicity and pro-communist policies of the British and American governments. So it's interesting. It's worth reading if you can get your hands on a copy. Hopefully it'll be republished sometime relatively soon because it has gotten more popular. More easy to find ones that are a lot less expensive, assuming you just buy them off Amazon. One is 3 Sips of Gin by Tim Bax. It is, I think, by far the best combat memoir of the conflict. What's the one that often gets promoted? Fire Force by Chris Cox. Yeah, it's okay, but I don't think I think 3 Sips of Gin is far, far better as like a book and as a history of what was going on. It's just better written and more engaging. It's quite good. He was a Cella Scout, which was one of the elite units in the war. A second is called A Pride of Eagles. I forget the author's name, but it's nominally a history of the Rhodesian Air Force. But really, it's a really good history of the Rhodesian state and of the Bush War. It just goes from beginning to end, describing how it was founded, what the early struggles were, how they built themselves up, how they built an air force, how they built an industrial and agrarian civilization, and then how the Bush War went. So it's quite long. It's a really large book, but it's easy to find on Amazon, and it's a fabulously written just study of the war. Another, it's on my shelf. I always forget the name. Sorry, one sec. Winds of Destruction. Sorry about that. I always forget the name of this book, but it's called Winds of Destruction, somewhat like Pride of Eagles. It's theoretically about the Air Force and a personal combat memoir, but it's a fabulous history of the Rhodesian state from beginning to end, how the war was fought at the infantry level, the Air Force level. It goes over like everything about Rhodesia from the founding of the country to the end, with a focus on military matters, but really about everything. And it's really, really good, really well written. There are some parts you can skip over if you're not interested in his personal life, but on the whole, it's fabulous. And then there's one called A Handful of Hard Men. It's about the Rhodesian SAS. It's pretty good, but not as good as 3 Sips of Gin. And there are others kind of like that where they're fine, but not as great. So I'd start with those 3 main ones if you want like a general history of the war, general history of the conflict. Yeah.
That's helpful. Do you have any plans to write on this? I mean, you think you'll ever write a book on it?
Maybe. I probably will at some point. I haven't had time yet, and I'm still kind of... I want to have my thoughts fully fleshed out on the political side of it before doing a book on it that would get into that. But I probably will over the next decade at some point.
Awesome. And then final thing you mentioned, you have a podcast. Where can people check that out?
Yeah, so my podcast is called The Old World with Will Tanner. It's on Spotify or on my Substack, which is just theamericantribune.news. I write about this stuff a couple times a week and do a podcast on Wednesdays. And it's really just similar to this sort of thing.
Awesome. We'll definitely encourage people to check that out. It's been a fascinating conversation. Will, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate you bringing me on.
Absolutely.
Stay safe. Mask up. Get the vax. Don't take unnecessary risks. Be careful. We've been coddled, smothered in warnings, trained to fear and avoid risk. We've been taught to play it safe and be on our guard. And not just against a scraped knee or a failed endeavor. No, we've been taught to censor our speech, our words, even our thoughts. Don't think those dangerous thoughts. Don't notice. Don't speak out. If you do, we're coming for you. Who's coming for you? It almost doesn't even matter. Whether it's the HR lady at your company of either sex, weaponized church courts, the social media censors, or even those you once considered allies. Watch out. Take care. Play it safe. But was it always this way? Have we always lived under this kind of stifling, wet blanketing panopticon? Is this the spirit of our Christian forefathers? of the men who founded our nation in blood and in faith, willing to face down all the might of Britannia and her redcoats? There was a time when Americans didn't shrink from risk, when they would rather die than bend. Our Christian forefathers knew what it was to draw the sword and throw away the scabbard. They knew what it was to set sail for the unknown. They defied tyrants. They built, explored, and dared great things. Who settled this land? Who built one of the greatest nations ever to be? Who settled the West and covered the continent from sea to sea with a Christian people? Who searched out glories, crisscrossed the plains with railroads, and fought off usurpers and invaders on all sides? Risk wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Without it, our fathers knew, there was no greatness. And now, we're supposed to trade boldness for bureaucracy? We're supposed to tremble at the unknown instead of mastering it? We're supposed to bow and scrape, not even before bullets, but before HR ladies? We don't think so. It's time to remember who we are. This year, join us here at New Christendom Press for our annual conference, Safety Third, Recovering the American Will to Greatness. 4 days to forge new friendships, build coalition, and work to recover what was lost. It's time to reclaim the spirit that built this nation, to break free from fear, to risk, to build, to lead. The future belongs to the bold.